Good day, ladies and gentlemen. The program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. The program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting jewishinsider.com. We are delighted to be joined today by Jeffrey Goldberg, acclaimed journalist, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, and close friend of AJC. Mr. Goldberg will be in conversation with Simone Rodan-Benzaquen, director of AJC Europe, to discuss today's massive infodemic, how it is impacting the United States and the world amidst the global pandemic, and what the geopolitical implications will be. After we hear from Simone and our esteemed guest, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. Simone, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Emily. I would like to welcome our viewers around the world who are with us today. I couldn't be more excited to have a good friend of AJC's and of mine, Jeffrey Goldberg, with us today, particularly at a time that can certainly be called historic for so many reasons. So Jeff, you and I first met in 2014 when you wrote a cover story for The Atlantic on anti-Semitism in Europe, and we'll address the issue of anti-Semitism later on in the program. But I had the opportunity to witness up close for what journalism is about. When I saw you on the ground interviewing people that probably most French journalists had never bothered to interview, go places where most French journalists probably don't go. And I accompanied you also to an interview you did with then French Prime Minister Manuel Valls. Now, I'm not great in making compliments. I'm a European. But I remember just really being very impressed by your capacity to dig deep, to go on the ground, to investigate, to get your interlocutors to speak about things they probably had no intention of speaking about before going into the interview. And I remember just thinking, well, this is what sort of real journalism is about. So this brings me to the actual question, if we can kick this off. How has the coronavirus crisis and the lockdown affected the way you do journalism?
First of all, thank you for having me. It's nice to see you virtually. I haven't seen you in a while. And it's good to be with the American Jewish Committee, of course. I mean, it's interesting because I'm in Washington right now, and all of a sudden Washington decided that the pandemic is over because we're all going outside to, there are many people who are participating in protests. Obviously, there are many police officers and soldiers, quite for reasons we could talk about why there's so many soldiers on the streets right now. And there are quite a lot of reporters outside, all breathing on each other. So I'm sure the pandemic story will be coming back in 1 to 2 weeks. But right now, in the environment I'm in, it seems as if there is no pandemic, just protests. I say that because we have been seriously affected. Obviously, economically, journalism institutions have been affected by this, as has other, other businesses. Pretty profoundly in a pretty serious way. but we are affected by it because we've been locked down the same way everybody else has been locked down. And journalism is in part an act of going outside and talking to people and going places and figuring out things with your own, as you mentioned. I mean, you can certainly write about anti-Semitism in France by surfing the net, interviewing experts like you on the phone, but it's a lot better to go to Toulouse directly, and see what's happening. And so that's been a difficulty. The fact, just like you, that our office has been closed for 3 months, and so everybody's kitchen is their office, is making it very difficult. And what's so interesting about moments like these is that precisely at a time when people want quality journalism, and I will assert that the Atlantic, among other places, makes quality journalism. People want fact-based, pressure-tested, true information. More than ever, it becomes harder and harder to make for economic reasons, for logistical reasons, for every reason. And so we live inside this contradiction where precisely at a time when it's so hard to do our jobs, we have to do them more because so many more people want what we're making. That, by the way, is very encouraging. I mean, given the subject of what we're supposed to be talking about in this conversation, that's a very good thing. I mean, the fact that our audience has doubled in size in the last 4 months digitally means that people are turning to us for quality information. That the consumer has matured, even as the internet in some ways hasn't matured. They know where to go to find things that are true, and so the burden is on us to create more and more quality stories. But it's also quite a burden. And we're people, despite what the President of the United States might say. We're actually human beings as well as other people, and we have families, and we have people who get sick, and we have people who have troubles in this period, and so we have to deal with all of that at the same time.
So you mentioned a little bit, to some extent, the silver lining, meaning the fact that to some extent people are looking to get serious information from serious journalism. I know there is also a downside to this, and you recently actually addressed the issue. You launched something called Shadowland, which was sort of a multi-article project about conspiracy thinking. And for this, you wrote a piece where you said that the conspiracy theory is actually an existential threat for our democracy. We've obviously seen more of that during the lockdown. But can you help our audience understand why you think this really is an existential threat?
Yeah, and it's right in line with things that we've been talking about for several years, and obviously, AJC has been working on. I mean, remember, in this particular context of what you do, and a subject I'm very interested in, obviously, conspiracy theories, along with extremism, and it is extremists who generally propagate conspiracy theories, never been very, very healthy for the Jewish people throughout history, right? For all of the most obvious reasons in the world. The most successful, longest running show in the conspiracy world has been the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And I started that piece that we posted a few weeks ago, which you can find on theatlantic.com even today. I started that piece in Egypt, actually, almost 20 years ago, right after 9/11. I had gone to Cairo a few days after the attacks, sort of starting what turned out to be a fairly endless trip through the region, because Egypt, more than a lot of countries, was at the time very susceptible to conspiracy thinking. This is when I met Mohammed Atta's father. Mohammed Atta was the leader of the hijackers. I met him 7 days after the hijacking. He told me he had already developed, or someone had developed for him, a very elaborate theory about how his son was still alive, that it was the Mossad and not Al-Qaeda that had conducted the hijackings. And it was just a sign of a kind of a psychological sickness. But this was not just the father of an extremist. This was at the top levels of government, at the top levels of newspapers, all kinds of fantastical theories about how the world works. And what you understand very quickly about conspiracy theories is that conspiracy theories we're always susceptible to them, because as human beings, we need to find coherence in a very, very complicated world. And so what conspiracy theories do is they hand you a package. And what they also allow you to do is externalize your own problems. I mean, American Jewish Committee literally been working on this for 100 years plus. You are not to blame for your economic situation. You are not to blame for your political situation. You are not to blame because you're a loser. It's the Jews. It's the this. It's the that. It's the other thing. You have to actually put some meat on the bone. You can't just say it's the Jews. You've got to give them theories and propaganda and all kinds of things. That's what we were finding, obviously, and still find to a great degree in Egypt, where people externalize the problems of Egypt and explain Egypt's shortcomings or governmental failures by blaming other parties. I use that as an example because I remember in my days moving around the Middle East that there are a lot of different people, a lot of different groups that were susceptible to conspiracy thinking. And I always had this in the back of my mind that America, because it's transparent, because it's democratic, because it's part of the Enlightenment, America always had immunities. You could speak in terms of virology. America always had immunities to conspiracy thinking, but now we see that we're no more or less immune to the power and seductiveness of conspiracy thinking than any other group of people on the planet. And it is an existential threat. It's an existential threat to democracy. It's an existential threat to true communication. It's a threat literally to the election that's coming up. I mean, it was a threat in the last election. It might have been dispositive in the last election in 2016. And the enemies of democracy know how powerful it is, and they now have more and more tools to propagate quickly and effectively the worst kind of conspiratorial thinking. And so, yeah, if you care about the Enlightenment value that there is such a thing as empirical truth, and that things like science and logic and reason matter, then you're going to be worried about the rise of conspiracism.
Have you seen, before we move on to the next topic, have you seen or have you thought about, how to possibly, I mean, if this really is such an existential threat, as you say, and I actually agree with you, and as you said, AJC has been working on the issue for a very long time. What can be done to counter that? What can be done to fight it?
Well, that's the $1 million question, right? Or the $1 trillion question, because we have been asking in the quote unquote mainstream media, we've been assuming before Donald Trump was elected, we assumed that if you just put out true information or fact-checked information, or however you want to frame it, that people react to it by going, well, that sounds true. I will therefore make decisions about who I support, where I live, what I do, how I believe accordingly. But, in our country, I mean, you have this in France, certainly. Europe is very susceptible to this, historically and today. You have groups of people who have built or have had built for them alternative information ecosystems that are very, very closed, that explain everything you need explained to you in order to get yourself through the day. And not only are they closed, but they're armored, and so they're impervious to the penetration of logic or empirical truth. And so I think the question for anyone who works in an area where you are trying to get people to understand true observable things, we're all struggling to figure out how do you penetrate the mindset of somebody who is not with you on that side. And I would not say that we've had a very successful time of it. It is not as if the majority of Americans believe in these things, but an awful lot of people do, and they have the ability to sway elections, among other things. And obviously, in the European context, in the context in which we first met, the question of anti-Semitism in Europe, you find, to your chagrin, that you never actually killed the virus. It waxes, it wanes, it's suppressed, the immune system is strong in this country, even if it's weak over here. But you look at a place like Hungary, I mean, you can name a dozen countries, obviously, and you realize that, oh, it never actually goes away. So the hardest thing in the world is, how do I convince people who believe X that is not true? How do I convince them that they're just wrong without angering them and seeming condescending, and without seeming contemptuous of them? It's a very, very hard line to walk.
Yeah, indeed. So to move on to a slightly different topic, but that is obviously related. Again, an issue that you have worked on and that you and I have discussed for a while. Last year, you had an issue, a special issue again for the Atlantic, called "How to Stop Civil War."
Right.
And given the current context, and at least from where I sit on this part of the Atlantic, watching the news and hearing from my colleagues and friends, this obviously resonates quite a bit. How dangerous do you think the situation currently is in the United States?
Well, can I ask you a question based on what you're watching? Sorry.
You always do this.
Professional hazard. From where you're sitting, what do you see happening here? Or what is coming across the web for you? What is coming across TV for you? Does it seem like all American cities are on fire or something?
It's probably what it seemed to you like when you watched the news looking at the yellow vest movement in France. You probably had the impression that in the entire country was on fire, which to some extent wasn't entirely wrong, and that some sort of very strong boiling issues were coming to the surface.
Right. No, I mean, because we have the same problem where cable news, especially. I remember the other night, there was an anchor on one of the networks said Washington is burning, and they were showing the picture of the bathroom in Lafayette Square that was burning, but the rest of Washington wasn't burning, right? I mean, there was looting, there were bad things going on, but you can create the impression of chaos by focusing narrowly on the violent events that are actually very, very, very localized.
If I may, I'm not only speaking about the violence itself. What I mean more largely is the issue that you addressed in the piece last year on how to stop civil war, which basically came from the idea that there is a danger of civil war. Right.
I mean, civil war always exists in the back of the American mind as a not probable, but more than theoretical possibility, because it did actually happen once, right? And the country thought after the actual Civil War that we were going to be permanently unified. But, excuse me, Americans today seem less unified than ever. I mean, I want to be very careful and say that no one who wrote in that special issue thinks that an actual civil war in the 1861 meaning of civil war is going to happen. But there is this kind of widespread fracturing where people are not only retreating to different bubbles, but there's active hostility between or among different subsets and different groups. One of the articles in this issue dealt with the fact that what we're trying to make here, or demography is forcing the United States to try to figure out how to be the first truly peaceful multi-ethnic democracy, successful multi-ethnic democracy. We're moving from a majority white country to a majority non-white country. And so this is a live experiment in how you do that. And it's very interesting because I'll always have this in mind. It's something I asked Jim Mattis once when he was, actually it was even before he was Secretary of Defense. I asked him, and this is a question that one asks military leaders, national security leaders all the time. What's the biggest threat facing the United States today? And Jim Mattis said a few years ago, he said, the biggest challenge for America, and I was expecting Iran Russia, Russian disinformation, China, whatever. He said, the biggest challenge for America is that we don't seem to like each other very much anymore. And, you know, this is a man, 50 years in the national security complex. I take it seriously when he says that. He said, if there's no unity among the people, you can have a great army, but, and we're seeing this manifest itself today, if people who are watching, you could have a great army, but that won't protect you from the forces inside that are trying to pull everyone apart. And that's what it feels like. That's why we did this special issue. I don't think we're close to a meltdown by any stretch of the imagination, but there's a sour feeling, there's an angry feeling, there's a feeling on the part of many people that they're not heard. Everyone has become, to some degree or another, captive to sets of grievances. Some of those grievances are entirely legitimate. Some of the grievances are not. And it's hard to see people understanding what the other person is going through. I mean, that's what a lot of these protests are about, is an African-American community that looks at white America and says, you really just don't understand what it's like to walk down the street in America as a Black person. And then you have white reaction to this. This is why we toggle back and forth between very different kinds of presidents now. I mean, I can go on all day about this, obviously, and I won't, but we're in a bit of a jam right now.
And so just to we at AJC, we believe in a strong center, a zone of compromise, a zone of potential
Right.
consensus. Do you think that's still possible, or as you just described, is it just are there too many divisions? Are there too many forces that pulling the country apart?
I don't know if there are too many divisions. There are too many forces that benefit from division. You know, when we introduced television cameras into the House and the Senate 20 some odd years ago, however long it was, probably longer than that. You know, we thought that would be an advancement for democracy, but what happened is legislators started performing for home audiences, putting on shows of their ideological purity. Compromise used to be a positive value on Capitol Hill. Now it's a negative value. And so the introduction of that technology changed things. Obviously, social platforms like Facebook very, very often reward division. You know, anger, the creation of anger and rage on the part of users is very, very good for business. It keeps you stuck to your screen longer. So we have all kinds of mechanisms to make people angry, and we don't have a lot of mechanisms that cool people down. And then in the absence of national leadership, you throw that into the mix, and or effective or moral national leadership, however you want to put it, you throw that into the mix, that becomes very combustible. So no, we're again, it's just not a healthy or coherent time in American political life.
You mentioned General Mattis yourself, and obviously, given that this is also the latest very big news that even came to my part of the Atlantic.
All the way across the Atlantic, get out.
All the way.
It's amazing what you do these days.
See? You published a statement by former Defense Secretary General Mattis yesterday. To the extent it's possible to avoid partisanship, Jeff, could you talk a little bit about what you think of that, and also about
I'm not running
how
for
it came about? How it came about. You pointed out in the article itself that General Mattis had a very different line when you interviewed him for the magazine a year ago. How did it happen? What happened there?
He feels that the president of the United States is threatening the Constitution. Things changed last week when they cleared the square outside the White House, Lafayette Square, with tear gas, it seems, in order for the president to go stand in front of a church and hold a Bible up. And a lot of people in the military, retired and current, thought, well, this is a bad scene, especially when he started talking about using federal troops to put down protests. There are a lot of red lines in the relationship between civilians and the military in this country and in others. That kind of talk was a red line that Jim Mattis clearly felt President Trump had crossed, and so he felt compelled to say something. He cares a lot about. This is why I want to come back to something, because I want to ask you this again and listen to you this time. But he cares about a couple of things more than other things. One is making sure that relations between the military and the civilians they serve are good, and that you don't, the point of the American military is to point outward and protect American civilians from foreign enemies, not to suppress Americans, right? And the second thing he worries about is America's standing in the world. I mean, this is the general who led Central Command, which is in charge of the entire Middle East from an American security perspective. And he is very worried about our image abroad, both with allies, people who have come over the last 80 years to trust us, and with adversaries, that if you look like a completely dysfunctional country, if you look like a place that smacks of authoritarianism, that's only going to hurt American security. So I come back to this issue because it's very, very important to me, is how, I'll just use France, how people in France are seeing America as an ally, as a stable democracy. Because I have a feeling that that after 3 years of the Trump administration, people are kind of scratching their heads in France going, wow, America looks like it's having a little bit of a nervous breakdown. That's at least what my friends in different places tell me.
Well, this is going to be part of a private and longer conversation. I can tell you that there's definitely there is definitely concern, I would say, but I would actually make the point that it just didn't start a few years ago. But I think there is definitely wider concern for about American leadership, and about the need for American leadership, and also about the wider transatlantic relationship. And I think I would argue it didn't just start a few years ago, but it's actually a longer process. But again, we'll have a longer conversation about this privately. Before I turn, because I know we're short on time, before I go to the last question, and this is really an important one because this is the very reason why we met. It's the question of anti-Semitism. When we met 5 years ago, it is because you interviewed me for the piece you wrote at the time on the future of European Jewish communities in Europe. You were very pessimistic at the time, and you and I actually had a debate about whether Jews should leave Europe or not, whether anti-Semitism would spread elsewhere. You argued that Jews didn't have a future in Europe, and at the time, at least, were a little less concerned about the United States. So my question is, would you write the same piece today? And how concerned are you about anti-Semitism in the United States today?
You're just trying to get me to say that American Jews should move to Europe. That's what you're saying.
You're more than welcome.
I know your tricks. I haven't reported on the story in 3 or 4 years. You know, one of the things that I noticed that after we did that story, that the problems that were, social problems, extremism problems that affect the Jewish community very often widen out and affect everybody. And that's part of the story of Europe right now. We've been so focused on our own issues in this country that it's hard for me or anyone else to sort of sit in judgment about European behaviors. Going back, to the root of the concern. I mean, you know this, and I'm sure this is a source of tension between us, because, and I admire your commitment to the future of European Jewry, and that's wonderful. And there are hundreds of thousands of Jews in Europe, and they need defense and protection and uplift and all the rest. I continue to believe that ultimately, in many ways, we're in the postscript period of European Jewish history, that the Shoah ended most of European Jewish history, and that some of the communities now are so small that they won't sustain themselves, whether or not there's outside pressure from anti-Semites or not. And so the underlying conditions remain. And obviously, we're not talking that much about jihadist ideology right now and all of the rest. But from what I can tell, Jewish communities continue to be under pressure, but Jewish communities are also not immune to some of the other pressures in the world as well. I do worry, obviously, but I worry about that here as much as I worry about it in Europe. I worry that coronavirus-inspired conspiracy theories, economic collapse-inspired conspiracy theories, tend to disproportionately negatively affect the Jewish communities, because that's always been the pattern of behavior. But I want to tread carefully here, because recognize the complexity of it, that the main Jewish centers after World War II became Israel and the United States, and that Europe became a much smaller presence in global Jewry, but it's alive there, and and these communities deserve protection and deserve every fighting chance to survive and flourish as any other communities. But yeah, the underlying trends are still something I worry about. I know you're there fighting it every day, so it'll probably be okay.
We certainly are and won't give up.
Not to put too much pressure on you, but if you could just save European Jewry, that would be great.
I'm doing my best.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I'll know that there are a huge amount of questions. So Emily, to you.
Thank you, Simone, and thank you, Jeff. A reminder to our viewers that you can submit your questions to questions@ajc.org. Questions is plural, or use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. We've been receiving a ton of questions, and the first question we've received a few similar ones. The first one is, in light of the numerous and apparently intentional attacks on journalists, do you think this is related to President Trump's declaration of the media as the enemy of the people?
Yes. Would you like me to say more than yes?
Yes. Do you want to elaborate a little?
I mean, it's as clear as day. I mean, the only answer to possibly give is that there's a direct line. Of course, it's true. I mean, if the president of the United States uses a Stalinist term, enemy of the people, to describe the free press of the United States of America as enemies of the people, as enemies of freedom, of course, journalists are going to suffer. The answer is absolutely yes. It's unprecedented. I mean, very few presidents like the media, but until this president, previous presidents have understood the role the press plays in a healthy democracy. So yeah, I've said it repeatedly. I think his language is going to get somebody killed someday, because somebody's going to take it seriously. It's terrible.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Merle Horowitz in Atlanta. Once calm returns after riots worldwide, and we hopefully change racially charged issues, will anti-Semitism be a part of that discussion?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know. I mean, it's, you know, last year, because of the Pittsburgh shootings and the shooting in California, anti-Semitism, and the news moves so quickly now that we forget that just 3 or 4 months ago, this issue of anti-Semitism on the streets of New York was a national crisis. Obviously, I guess I'm just guessing here, but that was ameliorated somewhat by the fact that people don't go on the streets very much right now, or at least haven't for the last couple of weeks. But I would hope so, because anti-Semitism is a live subject in the United States. It's obviously a concern. Jews are disproportionately affected by hate crimes, as counted by the FBI and other agencies. And so I would like to see that, and I would like, you know, and just I'm speaking as an individual, I would like to see efforts made not to divide these issues and say that anti-Semitism is not a legitimate subject to talk about. Of course it is. Obviously, the experience of African Americans in this country is unique for an obvious set of reasons. And that is obviously going to be a preoccupation of society. going forward, or one hopes that it will be for a long time. But I would think that any prejudice, including prejudice against Jews, ought to be dealt with in whatever national reckoning is coming.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Leslie Rubin in Colorado, who writes, Biden is not a particularly ideological politician. He represents the center left in a party that seems to be moving further left. Will he be able to address these major issues that our country faces? And is he actually better positioned to do so because of his temperament?
I want to answer this carefully because I don't. I mean, the analysis is correct that Biden, though he's moving left to meet the younger portions of the party, he got the nomination, or he's getting the nomination, in part because he didn't represent that leftmost side of the Democratic Party. It seems like the events of the last couple of weeks, the last week, are going to move him further to the left. And, you know, the reason that one could think that he's going to be effective at this is that his ties to the African-American community are so deep and profound. Obviously, it was the African-American community in South Carolina that saved his candidacy. And so he's been in a tight relationship with that community for a very long time. So one imagines that he'll be preoccupied with this and has a good a chance as anyone else of dealing with it. But I mean, who can possibly speculate at this point about the course of this current story or the national election? I learned the hard way in 2016, like many journalists or like many people, that it's not worth trying to predict what's going to happen in American elections.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Barbara Simon in Westchester, who asks, what can we as Americans do to better identify and combat misinformation, especially in the lead up to the presidential election?
You know, it's an interesting question because I'm always torn when I see nonsense come over the web to me through Facebook, Twitter, wherever it comes. Some of it is just so utterly stupid that you kind of just want to ignore it. You know, it's hard to spend your day paying attention to nonsense. But you know, what I would say to, and I make the suggestion to people I know, it's when their Uncle Mel is sharing something in social media that is so obviously, I don't know why I picked the name Mel, but everybody has an Uncle Mel, is sharing something absurd. You know, don't just go, thanks, Mel. Say, Mel, this is wrong, and here's why, and send them. You might not convince Mel to take it down or to change his mindset, but at least there's pushback. There's an argument. I mean, I think, you know, people who work at the American Jewish community obviously have to confront these questions every day, you know, because you're fighting misinformation, disinformation, falsehood. Do you ignore it and hope that it disappears? Do you fight it and possibly elevate it by the fight? Because remember, a lot of, let's talk in your specific context as an organization, a lot of anti-Semites want to engage, want to get into a loop with big organizations, important organizations like the AJC, because that elevates their absurdity, right? I mean, I noticed this once, you know, when you fight with Holocaust deniers on Twitter, they're loving it, you know, because people are paying attention to them. It's a very, very hard question, but I used to say ignore, and now I say, you know, just straightforwardly, not in an ad hominem way or an insulting way, just say, this is actually wrong. Here's the information. Here are the sources. Please read it. And then move on with your day, because you can't spend your entire day arguing with idiots.
Thank you. Our next question is from Carla Stein in Miami, who asks, you know Israel well. You have written a lot about Israel. Where do you see the U.S.-Israel relationship going? Is there still a political consensus in the US for bipartisan support for Israel?
I don't think I'm getting paid enough for that question. I'm not getting paid at all, by the way, for this. I don't know. Again, I'm not going to predict. I mean, we're looking at this government, the Israeli government possibly annexing land in the Jordan Valley. That's going to cause a crisis. That is going to specifically cause, just talking about it in the political context, that specifically is going to cause a crisis with the Democratic Party. It seems as if the Trump administration, Mike Pompeo, Jared Kushner, and so on, are behind that. That's going to cause an immediate crisis. The longer term trends don't seem that helpful to me, but I want to acknowledge that I don't know where it's headed. I mean, I think two things can be true. The relationship between the U.S. and Israel has been remarkably stable for generations. Majority of Americans still have a positive feeling for Israel, but in the younger generation, especially on the leftward side of the ledger, and there are many more young people on that side than on the right side, especially now. I think that's changing, and I don't think, and I'm saying this analytically, I don't think Trump's embrace of Israel has helped Israel's cause with young Americans, because young Americans are majority opposed to Donald Trump. And this is a process that predated Donald Trump. And I know that organizations like yours have been working on this issue, but the secret of Israel's political success in America is that it has Democratic friends and Republican friends. It's not a partisan cause, or has not been a partisan cause. If it becomes a partisan cause, then all bets are off.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Melanie Nelkin in Atlanta. The Jewish community has experienced a lot of ruptures in the Black-Jewish relationship since the Civil Rights Movement. We are now at a crossroads. What do you feel would be the best way to rebuild that relationship today?
Oh, that's not my job. I'm not commenting. I'm a journalist. I just analyze problems, and I'm not here to provide solutions. That's why you have an American Jewish Committee. I appreciate the question, but I can't go down that road. But you could ask Simone over there. Actually, she's in charge of Europe. Don't ask Simone.
Our next question, and I think this will be the final question, from Benjamin Siegel in Arlington, who asks, what has the coronavirus taught us about U.S. national security? As an American, I used to believe that a strong military would keep me safe. We have now seen this virus become the largest killer of Americans since World War II. Is it fair to think that we would have invested less in our military if we could have invested more in healthcare?
We spend more on healthcare than we spend in the military now. We spend more on education than we spend in the military now. I don't think it's a zero-sum game. We're a big country that can do 2 or 3 things at once, or we used to be able to do 2 or 3 things at once. I mean, the biggest surprise, one of the bigger surprises to me is about all this, is that I used to think that the CDC was the gold standard worldwide for disease prevention, and they obviously are having some serious problems on that front. There's been a lot of disinvestment, obviously, in recent years in those government functions. I think the question there's a profoundly important point embedded in that question, which is that national defense, national security has many, many different components. It's not just protecting the United States from Chinese warships or Russian internet disinformation campaigns or jihadist terrorists or the Iranian nuclear program. Disease control and prevention is hugely important. Clean water and air, these are hugely important things. And obviously over the last several years, you've seen, thinkers in the Pentagon talk about climate change as a national security issue, just to give one example. It is also true that a lot of money is spent on healthcare in America. Maybe it's not spent the right way. People with comorbidities, with underlying conditions are obviously much more susceptible to coronavirus, among other things. And we have a relative to some other countries, an unhealthy population. And so that's another kind of weakening. So I understand the point. I also believe that you can have your aircraft carriers and you can have a CDC at the same time. We're pretty big. We're still the biggest economy in the world. We still have the most powerful military in the world. We still have the best universities in the world. It's not finished and done with, but we have to find ourselves again. And by the way, one final point on that, it wasn't that long ago that the United States, when President Obama was president, identified a problem in West Africa, the Ebola outbreaks there. The World Health Organization wasn't doing a good job. The UN didn't know what to do. Finally, the US said, you know what, we'll get this. We got this. They sent the US military over to Liberia. The British then joined in Sierra Leone, and they stamped out the epidemic. I mean, that was a United States funded and operated project to a great degree. And it was, 5 years ago. We're not talking about another era in American history. These things are doable. But you have to make sure that the mechanisms are working. You have to make sure that people understand that government, going back to this discussion about conspiracies, that government can actually, I know this sounds like a radical statement today in America, but government can be a force of good, right? And I come back to this idea that what happened to the CDC? No one likes paying taxes. I mean, most people don't like paying taxes, but most people like what they get for their taxes. A Coast Guard, a Marine Corps, an FDA, a CDC, Social Security checks that come every month, and on and on and on and on and on. And what you realize is if you don't pay attention to that stuff, it does wither. And so that's one of the lessons here, I think, is that when you don't pay attention to how the mechanisms, functions of government are being treated, when there's a crisis like this, you're gonna come up short. And that's, by the way, I'm sorry to go on, but that's one of the reasons I keep asking Simone the question about how the U.S. is being perceived in Europe, because we are used to the United States being hated, loved, admired, respected, feared, all the things that people feel about a superpower, right? Sometimes those feelings come in big packages together. What we're not used to as Americans is being pitied, right? And what we're hearing overseas is people looking at America and thinking, wait a second, why are they having a nervous breakdown? For good or not good, America has been the superpower, the dominant Western superpower for 80 years. And this is a interesting and very fraught moment when people are looking at America and just kind of almost feeling sorry for it, which is a new emotion for a lot of people. And so that's sort of where we are. I'm straying far afield from the question, but it was on my mind.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Simone.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That last bit wasn't particularly uplifting, but I know you're generally not an optimist.
I don't do uplift.
Listen, I know how busy you are, particularly right now when time and space seem to have entirely disappeared, when the world has become flat. So I really take it as a token of friendship that you have taken the time to sit down to speak to us today. I hope to see you soon in person when we can sit down in a cafe in Paris or in DC. I would like to go to
Paris. I would like to go anywhere, actually.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Especially now that you say that, I mean, I hear you say that the government is a force of good. You're perfect for Paris.
So I could be a French politician. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It's good seeing you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye.
Emily?
Thank you, Simone. And thank you, Jeff, for joining AJC today and for the important conversation. I also want to thank our audience for joining us and showing your commitment to the topics discussed here today. In these unique times, while so many of us are separated from our family and friends, AJC is still bringing us together on the issues that matter. Please consider making a donation to AJC so we can offer you more programs like this one, and so we can continue our advocacy work around the world on behalf of the Jewish people. Visit ajc.org/donate. Our next Advocacy Anywhere program will feature a conversation with AJC CEO David Harris, who will discuss the Six-Day War and why it still matters 53 years later. This program will take place tomorrow, Friday, June 5th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. I hope you will join us. And lastly, for the first time in AJC history, AJC will be holding a virtual global forum, which will take place June 14th through 18th. This 5-day online event will feature a moving opening plenary, conversations with world leaders, spirited debates, and the high-level content you have come to expect at an AJC Global Forum. For more information and to receive live updates and announcements in your inbox, please visit ajc.org/globalforum. Thank you again for joining us today. Please stay safe and healthy. Goodbye.